To everyone, but we'll sing it through this morning. 602, Walking in the Light. We'll sing it out on that first verse now. No more I wander in the dread. Good start this morning. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord, thank you for today. Thank you for your word, and Lord, that you would guide our hearts and unite us together. And Lord, this morning be with Brother Tim as he comes and share some more about the land of Israel. And Lord, that you would just unite us today and meet with us. We thank you for your presence and your promises, and Lord, all that you've done. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. You may be seated.
All right. Brother Ben, will you bring me a clicker? Okay, I need some teen boys and John to come up here and help me get these passed out as quickly as possible. Several teen boys. Oh, and pastor. All right.
Excuse me.
So everybody, just one sheet of paper, okay, if you're doing this with us. When we started this series, one of the main things that I wanted to talk about, and actually John back there in the sound booth, we just have the camera on now, not really that map, we're going to do that one later, okay? One of the main things that I wanted to do was have you learn how to just take a piece of paper, fold it, sketch a map of Israel, and put on there, about a dozen key locations that you can do by memory, okay? And one of the things we know about learning is that repetition helps us learn, okay? So I don't apologize for us taking 5 minutes out of each of these Sunday school lessons to actually redo this map, because I feel like this is something that will help. And one of the other reasons we're doing this series is I want you to see some of the historical and biblical connections between these cities. These are, we're calling this Bible lands, okay? So we don't call it the Holy Land because there's nothing holy about Israel. It's just this is where Bible events took place. And sometimes by studying it in this way, at least this has helped me, in studying it by looking at the geography and then branch out from there and say, well, what happened in the Old Testament? What happened in the New Testament? What happened maybe in history that's not in the Bible but connects to that place? It kind of ties in an interesting, hopefully interesting, way and makes some different connections, all right? So you remember how we fold this if this is your first time. My daughter Sarah is here from Wisconsin, and my grandkids. And So we're taking this paper, we fold it in half this way, fold it in half again, so we have a column, fold it up once this direction, and then again. All right, everybody follow that? And we have Bev Hammond here. Nice to have Bev here with her daughter-in-law and son. So fold it, so we have these squares, all right? Now I was thinking about this again, one of the reasons as well that we're doing this series of lessons, and this kind of hit me this week, just the realization that these are real historical places. Amen. Some people try to say, oh, well, the Bible was just written by men and it was just made up. But, you know, there's a tremendous amount of very specific geography. When I was in Israel a few years back, our guide was telling us about an archaeologist who just from studying the Bible and thinking about the area, the particular area over in the Philistine area, said, I think there is this important city in such and such a location. All of his peers mocked him, said, no, there's nothing there. You're crazy. That city is probably down such and such. But he said, no, from studying the Bible, I think this is where it will be. He couldn't get any funding, so he raised his own money and started digging and uncovered exactly what he expected to be there. Okay, so the Bible was his guidebook to help him find the geographical area. All right, here we are. If you have been studying this and you are ready, go. If you, and don't watch me, okay? But if you need to watch, then let's review again. We're going to put a dot here, a starting point, a dot here, straight up, over a little bit, and then kind of off the middle of this square. All right, so we have the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River. Of course, this is Mount Carmel, and now we're going to put in the Jezreel Valley. All right, we have a city right on this line where this coast intersects. Anybody remember what that's called? Netanya, okay? Which again, it's not in the Bible, but important city today. Halfway up is Caesarea. A third of the way down is Joppa, which today is Tel Aviv. And then further down here would be Gaza. Way up here is Mount Hermon, but near that is Caesarea Philippi. Over here is Dan. And way over here is, I keep saying Tyre, it's Tyre. But I can't erase it, Tyre, all right. Let's see. Coming down here, right in between these, this is actually, if you were to squeeze your paper, this would be a mountain range right here. And level with the top of the Dead Sea is Jerusalem. So I like to put a star there because that is the capital. Just below that on the line is Bethlehem. And down below that is Hebron. Down here is, and this is new, we're going to see this today, En-Gedi. Right up here on this line is Samaria, specifically Sychar. All right, let's see if I'm, oh yes, let's put right across from Jerusalem near the river, it would be Jericho. And actually that's one of the cities we're going to talk about today. So I want you to label Jericho. Next week is going to be the last week that we're going to try to do this, and I'd like for you to try to do it by memory, okay? So study it a little bit this week if you need to. Let's see, Brother Ben, can you bring up the map of the Judea that you had up a little while ago? What we're going to do today is kind of zero in on this area right here, okay? So we've already covered up here. In fact, let me bring this map back. So we discovered after the fact last week that we weren't recording the Sunday school lesson last week, and so we didn't get this map on the video, but you remember this is the Sea of Galilee, kind of shaped like this, and we had these cities going around the edge, so we kind of zeroed in on this top part. If you wanted to, you could put on your map Nazareth, okay? And if you wanted, the main cities, if you wanted to label some up there by the Sea of Galilee, would be Capernaum and Bethsaida. Those would be the two main ones where Jesus performed most of his miracles. But if you look up there at the map that you see on the wall now, we have some of the cities labeled that we're going to talk about today. The one that we did not put on here yet would be Bethany. Okay, that's actually very close to Jerusalem, down to the south and a little bit east of Jerusalem. So if you want to label that on your map, Bethany. All right. All right, get your Kahoot out. Let's go. We'll do a quiz, but before we dive into today's lesson, use the Kahoot app or go to kahoot.it and see how much you know about this Judean area. And let's see, the number for this quiz is Classic. We'll click on Classic. And here we go. Ready to join. Here's the number, 499710. 499710. I'll wait for you to get a few. Wow, look at all those names popping up there. Cool. Somebody said Dad. Okay. All right, looks like we're paused. Let's move ahead. Let's start, and let's try the first question. The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered in 1947 were found in Qumran, Jerusalem, En-Gedi, Petra. Qumran, Jerusalem, En-Gedi, or Petra. And we have 2 seconds, 1 second, go. Okay, the correct answer is Qumran. All right, next. When not in Galilee, where did Jesus live? Where was his home when he was not in Galilee? Jerusalem, Bethany, Bethlehem, Capernaum. 4 choices, 10 seconds. Okay, I think 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Actually, Bethany was his home. Capernaum was up in Galilee. Tricky. All right, Mr. Inger. Remember, the faster you answer it, the more points you get. Herod was afraid of a Jewish revolt, and so he built the fortress at Antonia, Caesarea Philippi, Caesarea Masada. Malasada is a Hawaiian donut. Antonia, Caesarea Philippi, Caesarea Masada. 1 second. Guess. Ooh, the majority got that right. It is Masada. Okay, next. The Wailing Wall is a remaining portion of the Great Temple Mount built by whom? David, Nehemiah, Solomon, Herod. You have 4 choices. Who built the famous Wailing Wall? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ooh, okay. So we have a lot to learn today. This is proof that we have to learn some things. Go. Jericho is known, well, this is like, 2 truths, 1 false. Jericho is known for all of the following except an oasis with spring of fresh water, ministry of Elijah and Elisha, place where David hid from Saul, home of Zacchaeus and Bartimaeus. All of those are true except one. Which one did not take place in Jericho? Oh, good. Okay. We do not know that David hid there. All right, next. The Mount of Olives is known for all of these except, okay? So the Mount of all of these are true of the Mount of Olives. Transfiguration of Christ, ascension of Christ, prayer of agony in the garden, and the Olivet Discourse. One of those did not happen on the Mount of Olives. Which one was not? 3, 2, 1. Okay, good. Transfiguration, probably up on Mount Hermon. All right, last question. Chris pulled ahead. David was crowned king and reigned 7 years in Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Hebron, Bethel. All right, 10 seconds. 8, 5, 4, 3. And I kind of tricked you. I put a picture of Jerusalem there to see if that would throw you off. But hey, you got Hebron. Good. Oh, Chris, you did it again. Okay. And then me, I was not playing. Who's bees? Who's bees? Oh, Brother Brian in the back. Okay. All right, take your, you can put that away now. We'll do one at the end if we have time with locations of the Judean cities. But let's go to Genesis chapter 13. Brother Ben, is that clicker up here? Oh, there it is. Okay, thank you. So this is the area, and if you have these cities on your map, we're going to talk first about Sodom, which I don't have listed on there, okay? This is another reminder of the Dead Sea area. So here's the Dead Sea and the Judean hills. Here's Bethlehem and Jerusalem right here, okay? And that's not Hebron, that's, that's Mount Hebron. But very mountainous compared to the coast. And up here is the Sea of Galilee, so again, a different perspective. The Dead Sea, Sodom and Gomorrah were located somewhere in the Dead Sea area. Today it is, very dry and not much to see there. But before their destruction, the region of Sodom and Gomorrah were a beautiful garden. You're here in Genesis 13. Look with me at verse 10. Remember when Lot and Abraham separated, Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord. Now, that's definitely not the way it looks today in that area. Then Lot shows him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves the one from the other. Abraham dwelt in Canaan, Lot dwelled in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent toward Sodom. So we don't know the exact location of Sodom, but we do know it was beautiful when Lot first moved there. In Deuteronomy, Moses describes this area, and he says, the whole land thereof is brimstone and salt and burning. It is not sown, nor beareth, nor any grass groweth therein, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's many places that have been suggested as locations, and like I said, we don't know. It was destroyed, but based again on what the Bible says in these verses, I think it's likely that it was up here near the top portion, because we know that Abraham was in Bethel, and it said that Lot looked to the east in the plains of Jordan and saw that area and then moved in. So I think it's more likely up here than down here, but I'm not a Bible scholar. I'm not going to argue the point, okay? And this is what the area looks like today, just very dry and barren. And the Arabs actually call this mountain range back here the Mount of Sodom. Let's talk briefly now about the area called Qumran. We mentioned in the quiz that that's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The Essenes were a group of scribes who copied the Bible very, very, very carefully and preserved it and passed it on. And they didn't have, obviously, photocopiers and printing presses and things, so they had to do it by hand. And in AD 70, which is when Rome invaded and kicked out the Jews again and destroyed the temple. The Essenes took the scrolls, put them in clay jars, and hid them in caves. And it wasn't until 1947 that a shepherd was looking for some sheep, and he threw a rock way up. So that's why I think he was a teenage boy. He was practicing his throwing, and he threw a rock way up, and it went into a cave, and he heard a crunch, like it broke something. He said, "Whoa, what is that?" And he went scrambling up there, and here he found all these clay jars, and so he took them into town and sold them. And but they came back and did some more investigation and found out that these were very ancient, and yet they matched exactly the Old Testament Hebrew texts that were being used even almost 2,000 years later, which is pretty amazing. Let's take our Bibles and go to 1 Samuel. This is where this story about David hiding from King Saul takes place, and mentions this place, En-Gedi. So the last verse of chapter 23 and the first couple of verses of chapter 24 of 1 Samuel, David went up from thence and dwelt in strongholds at En-Gedi. And it came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, saying, "Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi." And Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. Now, if you just look at this picture, whoops, let me go back. All right. And you can see there's caves here, but it's steep. So up here on the top is level, where like Bethlehem and Hebron and that area is. And then you go down these cliffs, and down at the lower level is where the Dead Sea is, so dry and barren and not easy to get to. But David grew up in this area, so he knew where to hide, okay? And he was in one of these caves, it says, and in verse 3, Saul came to the sheepcotes by the way. There was a cave, and Saul went in to cover his feet. Okay, so nature was calling. He took care of his business. While he was in there, it says that David cut off part of his garment. And then when Saul wrapped up and left, David went out and said, here's what I got of yours, Saul. And you know the rest of that story. But anyways, this is the place where it took place, right along the Dead Sea. So there is a waterfall back in here, and this is kind of a lush green valley just right where the waterfall comes out. Let's talk briefly about Masada. This was not mentioned in the Bible, but this was built at the same time that Christ was ministering. It was built by the same Herod who built Caesarea and who rebuilt Jerusalem and the Temple Mount area. I understand that Herod, he had two great fears. One was that the Jews would overthrow him and put one of their own people in as king, so he feared for his life. And the other was he feared Cleopatra, the queen of Egypt. So he built this at the top of a mountain, and you can kind of see the steep walls on all sides of that. And he was one of the greatest builders of ancient times. So he built this fabulous palace that overlooks the Dead Sea. And Masada is really on this end of it, and the Dead Sea would be over in here, all right? Yeah, there's a better picture where you can, again, see another perspective of where the Dead Sea was. And so he thought, I'm safe up here. If they ever come after me, they won't be able to get me. Well, he died, okay, but then later some zealots, Jewish zealots, took over and destroyed the Romans who were there, and then about 1,000 Jews lived there in about AD 66, AD 70. Again, this is the view of the Dead Sea from the top of Masada. This is a representation of what his palaces would have looked like. And so they have been excavated, and some pretty amazing things. There's some columns that he had cut right into the wall. He had swimming pools, few swimming pools. Here's one of the big ones up on the top. This was a swimming pool. This is a cistern. Now, you can't see this very well, but there's a couple people standing in the bottom. Remember we talked about this last week, that they would try to bring in, this is the top of a mountain. They would bring in whatever rainwater they could, and their little gutters, and they would run that water in and try to fill this so that they would have plenty of water to meet the needs of the people living at Masada. This is another cistern. He had wheat in these were storehouses, and he had plenty of food We'll come back to Jericho in a minute. Let's see here. So the end of the story of Masada was that those zealots were there. When the Romans then came, it took them a few years to try to build a ramp to get up to Masada. And by the time they were getting up there, the Jewish zealots realized it's over. We're going to die. And so they all committed suicide, except for, I think, like 5 children and 2 ladies. And that's how, when they got up there, 10,000 Romans got up there and found out that they really didn't have anything to conquer. It was all done. Let's talk now about Jericho. And for this, I'd like for you to actually take your Bible and go to Luke. All right? Now, you were expecting me to go to Joshua, and that is a very familiar story about the city of Jericho. And when the Israelites came into Jericho, that was the first city that they took over, and I remember they marched around it for 7 days and then blew their trumpets and the walls collapsed and they marched in. The city of Jericho means city of palms, and the city actually has date palms, bougainvillea, fruit trees, and it's because there is a oasis there, an ancient spring that produces 1,000 gallons of water a minute. Okay, so that's a pretty good water supply. But otherwise, because it's so low on that plateau, it's below sea level. It's kind of like Death Valley in our area. It's very hot and humid. It's the world's oldest still inhabited settlement, and I mentioned in the quiz that actually, yes, Elijah and Elisha were active in this area, and this is where the prophets came to look for Elijah, after he took off in the chariot of fire. Remember that? And they gathered there in Jericho looking for him, thinking he must be around here somewhere. But we see a New Testament story here in Luke chapter 18 and verse 35. And it came to pass that as he was come nigh unto Jericho, a certain blind man sat by the wayside begging. And I'm not going to read the whole story. It's about blind Bartimaeus. And in chapter 19, Jesus entered and passed through Jericho, and behold, there was a man, Zacchaeus. So again, you're familiar with these Bible stories, but just to kind of connect that these happened in this city is what I want you to kind of see there. And this was located along the river. It actually was a perfect trade route. So coming from up in the Galilee area, people would travel south along the river. And then when they would get to Jericho, then they would cut up through the mountain range, through a pass, to get up to the Jerusalem area. So a lot of pilgrims would travel this way. And Jesus probably traveled this way often with his disciples. Some have questioned, whether the story of Joshua and the walls falling down actually happened the way it describes in the Bible. Did they really fall down? In 1907, excavations took place and archaeological digs, and there's a lot of evidence there. Here's some of the facts. I'll just read them to you quickly. I forgot to make this large print. These multiple digs have revealed collapsed mud brick walls that fell out and made a ramp at the base of the retaining wall, and that allowed the Israelites to go up into the city, just as the Bible says. They found a lot of burned jars of wheat. Now, I didn't know this, but I looked back in Joshua 6:24, and it says that they left everything and burned it. When the inhabitants of Jericho realized they were being besieged, and it was right after harvest, they would have had all of their crops in the city in jars and would have had it around them so that they would have plenty of food to eat for a long time, and water, In fact, I'm just reading the Old Testament right now, and some of these besieges by other countries would last years before the people would finally give up and the enemy would come in. So they were expecting a long siege. 7 days was short. And then as soon as they came in, it says they burned the city with fire. So in these excavations, they have found these pots loaded with grain and not touched. They did find, that there was one Babylonian garment and one gold thing removed from the city. No, I'm kidding. How were they doing? Let's see. Oh, and then also in the German dig in 1907, on the north side of the city, they found what they believed would be the house of Rahab the Canaanite. How do they know that? Because of the red cord in the window. No, I'm kidding. Because it's still standing. Everything else was destroyed. But there's this one piece that's still standing, and there's part of the wall, attached to it, just as the Bible, describes it, standing about 8 feet tall. Let's go to, so this is, they call it the Wadi Keet. That's a path, and you can hardly see it here, but it's a very narrow path that winds along the mountainside that the pilgrims would walk. So this is coming up from Jericho and coming up into Jerusalem. Disciples traveled a lot. Like I said, pilgrims traveled a lot heading to Jerusalem, and this also then would be probably what Jesus was picturing when he was talking about the Good Samaritan story. And there's a lot of hiding places where thieves could jump out and rob somebody. Let's talk about Hebron. Take your Bible now and go back to Genesis. All right, we're flipping all around here. You're going to find, but this is in the Judean area, Genesis 13. When Abraham came out of Ur of the Chaldees, and he came down from the north and down through Canaan, the Samaria area, came down here. This was obviously while the Jordan Valley was still very lush and beautiful, but he was up here on this mountain area, and it says in chapter 13 and verse 18, Abraham removed his tent. This is after he separated from Lot, who went to Sodom. Abraham removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and there built an altar unto the Lord. And actually, this city of Hebron is mentioned several times in relation to Abraham. He would travel someplace else and come back to the plains of Mamre or to Hebron. Flip over a couple pages to Genesis 23. And verse 19, after Abraham's wife Sarah died, it says he buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah, and that was the man who sold him the cave, the sons of Heth. Before Mamre, the same is Hebron in the land of Canaan. So that's where Sarah would have been buried as well. If we go to, we won't turn there now, but in Joshua 14, we find this is where Caleb, when they came into the land, he was one of the 2 spies, right? Caleb and Joshua were the only 2 who gave a good report. And when they came in, he came to this area of Hebron. Keep hitting the wrong button, okay. So there really are not a lot of pictures of excavations in some of these cities like Bethlehem and Hebron. I don't know, I think it's because it's in Palestinian-controlled areas, so it's a lot less safe to be in those areas digging, so we don't have a lot of pictures. But this is a modern picture of the city of Hebron. Another event that happened in Hebron in 2 Samuel is that this is where David was when Saul died, and then they anointed him king, and he really was king just over the southern area of Judea for about 7.5 years before the northern area accepted him as king, and then he went up to Jerusalem. All right, let's talk about Bethlehem. It's about 6 miles south of Jerusalem. Let's go to Genesis 35. Remember, Jacob went up to Laban, his uncle Laban, and he fell in love with Rachel, worked 7 years to marry Rachel, and then his father-in-law gave him Leah, and he worked another 7 years to get Rachel. And then we have here in chapter 35, after both wives had had several children, but in verse 19, and it came to pass as her soul, talking about Rachel, was in departing, for she died, that she called his name Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died giving birth to Benjamin. Rachel died, verse 19, and there was buried in the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. So this is one of the first references to the city of Bethlehem, and buried her right there. Let's see. Oh, here's an interesting one. I did not know this. Go to Judges. So when you think of the judges, okay, maybe think of Samson, right? He was a judge. Maybe think of the left-handed judge Ehud, Barak and Deborah were judges, but there are some others, and Gideon was a judge. But here in Judges chapter 12, One of the judges in verse 8, this was his hometown. We only have 3 verses about him. This is all we know. After him, Ibzan of Bethlehem judged Israel. He had 30 sons, 30 daughters. I would like to be his wife. 60 children. Whom he sent abroad and took in 30 daughters from abroad for his sons. And he judged Israel 7 years. Then died Ibzan and was buried in Bethlehem. Wow, that name didn't ring a bell to me. Ibzan and judge, his hometown is Bethlehem. So anyway, you learned something new this morning, okay? So Bethlehem was situated just 4 miles from, or 6 miles from Jerusalem. And there are terraced fields located nearby. This is also where Ruth and Boaz would have met and where Ruth would have collected the wheat, you know, and later married Boaz. And after they were married, they gave birth to David's father, Jesse, okay? And so this is why David grew up in this area, because his grandparents, Ruth and Boaz, lived in the Bethlehem area. This is where Samuel later came and found David and anointed him to be the next king over Israel. And centuries later, obviously, this is where Christ was born. And that's what people think of the most today, the birthplace of Jesus, but it also is the birthplace of Jesse. Today, it's under Palestinian control, and they have a huge, this has been here for centuries, huge church right over the spot that they believe is where Christ would have been born. And again, you see these Catholic churches are very ornate, and they're dark, and yet a lot of interesting lights and symbols and idols and candles and all kinds of stuff. Let's move to Bethany. Take your Bible now and go to the Gospel of Mark. We don't have any reference to Bethany in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, it was very significant. This is very likely the second home of Christ, when he wasn't up in Capernaum, and he was down here in the Bethlehem area. And it's because, in a slide that I'll show you here in a minute, this is only about 2 miles from Jerusalem, and it was on the back side of the Mount of Olives. And so it'd be very easy to just, there's a path there, a road. It'd be very easy to just walk over the Mount of Olives, come down, and you're in the city. And yet, when you get on the other side, it's like you're away from the hustle and bustle of the city. You might call it a suburb, living in the suburbs of Jerusalem. But here in Mark chapter 11, verse 1, Jesus, and when they came nigh to Jerusalem, unto Bethphage and Bethany, so Mark 11:1, at the Mount of Olives, he sent forth 2 of his disciples. So this is naming that city. There's another very small city, Bethphage, located kind of near there as well. This is the hometown of Mary and Martha and their brother Lazarus. Of course, you remember that story of Lazarus being raised from the dead. And of course, they have a church built where they think his tomb would have been. Simon the leper, they talk in the Bible, the Gospels talk about a meal that was served at his house, and Mary came and anointed the feet of Jesus while they were at that house. All these familiar Bible stories took place. So here in this picture, this is the Temple Mount. This is the Kidron Valley here, and this is the Mount of Olives, okay, this whole section. And if you follow this path down, the back side of the Mount of Olives is Bethany. But altogether, that's only about a 1.5-mile, 2-mile walk. So it's not, hop, skip, and a jump, but it could easily be done in a morning, okay? Very possible that after Christ was arrested on the Mount of Olives, remember Judas came and betrayed him with a kiss, and then the soldiers took him away. Obviously, they took him down here, okay? So as they're heading this way and the disciples are fleeing, where are they fleeing? Most likely, the disciples were very familiar with the home of Mary and Martha, and that would be a familiar location to them. So I think it's likely that they backpedaled on this path and went to their house to kind of wait things out and see what was going to happen. Let's go now to Matthew chapter 21 and verse 1. And the next slide, we're going to see the Mount of Olives, Matthew 21 and verse 1. And when they drew nigh unto Jerusalem, and were come to Bethphage unto the Mount of Olives. Then sent Jesus two disciples. So this is another telling of that verse we just looked at in Mark. But they're on the Mount of Olives, and he sends the disciples, and they bring the donkey from Bethphage, and then Jesus got on the donkey and rode into Jerusalem. And of course, the people thought he was coming to take over and to be the Messiah and be the leader, and that was not his purpose. He wanted to be the king in their heart, not their political leader. But they misunderstood that, and just a week later then, the crucifixion took place. And the same people are crying, crucify him, which is obviously pretty amazing. But here on this mountain, and you can see there's trees here. A lot of these trees have been planted just in the last 50 to 70 years. But even in the time of Christ, there were olive trees on here. Mount of Olives, okay? And Jesus often went here with his disciples. We know this because when Judas tried to find him, he knew where to go. He took the soldiers to the Mount of Olives. And specifically, somewhere on this mountain, I think it's over here, but I could be wrong, is the Garden of Gethsemane. So it's located in the lower portion, but on the Mount of Olives. So here's another picture, then you can kind of see a mountain range here. Bethphage, if you can read that, possibly was located there. Bethany, back here on the back side of the mountain. And then there's this path that comes up and into Jerusalem. It says the Jericho Road, and that's because this would come back through Bethany and then weave its way back down that mountain into Jericho, okay? From the Mount of Olives, looking towards Jerusalem, beautiful view of Jerusalem's eastern wall across what's called the Kidron Valley. Some more pictures. Some of these olive trees are about 2,000 years old, they believe. And so they have those well protected. So it's interesting while you're there. I mean, you're not worshiping the ground. Some of the Catholics do. You know, they want to kiss everything and touch everything and wipe a hanky on it and take it home and put it on a shelf. And, you know, honestly, it's just interesting to be there and realize this is where Jesus was. Okay, he was a real person, and his ministry was real, and the accounts in the gospel is a real account, and he very possibly saw these very same scenes. All right. You've heard about the Olivet Discourse, and that's at the end of the Gospel of Matthew. That's where Jesus talked about end times, things still to come, but he also predicted that the walls of the city of Jerusalem would be destroyed and that the temple would be destroyed. And that happened in AD 70, exactly as Jesus had predicted. And this is the site where Jesus ascended. We don't know the exact site, it doesn't matter, but from the Mount of Olives, he ascended back to heaven. Let's look at that briefly in Matthew 26, just a couple pages over. In verse 30, no, never mind. That's the reference where he went there after they had the Last Supper and they went to the garden and he was betrayed. I must not have the right verse number circled for where he ascended. That's fine. Oh, yes, I do. It's on the next page. Acts 1. Acts 1. Duh, that makes sense. Acts 1 is where we see the ascension. And, of course, you're familiar with verse 8. But look at verse 10. While they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, two men stood by him in white apparel, which said, Ye men of Galilee. And that's true. That's where most of the disciples were from, up in Galilee. Why stand ye gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, taken up from you into heaven, shall so come in like manner as they have seen him go. Then returned they unto Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet. So they were there on the Mount Olivet when Christ ascended and then returned to Jerusalem from there. Now, next week, we're going to dive a little deeper into talking about Jerusalem, and I just want to lay out a little groundwork today about Jerusalem. And actually, next week, we have an amazing video. I'll tell you about that in a little bit that we're going to watch next week instead of you having to hear me talk, okay? But Jerusalem will be, the Bible predicts this, the capital of Christ's millennial kingdom. Today, the site where the temple used to be, there now is a mosque, okay? So a Muslim temple of worship. You can see the text is kind of hard to read. This says Mount of Olives, and that's over here on the right-hand side of the screen. Then there's this deep Kidron Valley, and then up here on the hill is the Temple Mount. Now, the mount means, so the mountain actually is kind of shaped like this. Kind of comes to a point. So in order to build something on top, they had to level the ground. So they built retaining walls and then filled it in with dirt and rubble and then put a surface on top of that to make a platform. And then they could build the temple on top of that. And Solomon had actually done that first, but Herod had expanded that Temple Mount to make it much larger. Now, way back in the Old Testament, in the time of Abraham, we first read about this city of Jerusalem, and back then it was called Salem. All right, now you see the Kidron Valley on this side, and another river coming down on this side. And the Mount of Olives is all of this, again, on the right-hand side of the screen. Back here is where the temple later would be built. On the screen here it's called Mount Moriah. Does that ring a bell? That's where God provided the ram in place of Isaac. Okay? Later we'll find that's where Christ was crucified, is actually on this mountain. But the city of Salem is where Melchizedek was king. And when Abraham came back, he gave tithes to the king Melchizedek, who was the king of Salem. And it seems to indicate that he was a true worshiper of God. So there's another view of the city. This is in the time of David, so this is called the city of David. It's below Mount Moriah, and at the time, this was a threshing floor. And there was nothing built up there, and David had a palace here and built a city wall. And his intention was someday to build a temple, but it was his son Solomon who later would build a temple up there. Another view of the same thing. Here's the Kidron Valley, Hinnom Valley, okay, and this mountain in between. I always get confused about this, but over here on this side, this is actually called Mount Zion, okay? So I used to think they were the same thing, but it's not. And then over here's, all right, so David bought the threshing floor of Araunah on Mount Moriah, and that's where then Solomon came and prepared the temple. Herod then expanded this Temple Mount, made it much bigger. This is the temple on top of this whole Temple Mount. And this obviously is a drawing of what it might have looked like in the time of Christ. Look at these stairs coming up, okay? So people could come from the ground level, go up these stairs and into the city. This is the southeast corner, looking up from the Kidron Valley, eastern side of the wall here. And the southern part, again, it's kind of hard to see, but there's that reference point. That's obviously the Muslim temple. In Israel, somebody did, I forget the story who did this, but they have recreated the entire city of Jerusalem from the time of Christ with made to scale and using the same rocks. So it's a miniature Jerusalem, and it's just, I mean, you can walk around and look at it. It's very, very interesting. So this would be the temple right here, and it's facing the east. This is the eastern gate facing toward the Mount of Olives. So this is a representation inside a museum showing what the Temple of Herod would have looked like. This is one rock. Look at this. Herod and his, we don't know how they did this. These rocks were 40 feet long, 8 feet wide, 3.5 feet high, and each one weighed 80 tons. And they milled them so carefully, and you can see the edging here. You can still see this, so that they could put putty and things in there, but actually these rocks are milled so carefully that you can hardly get a piece of paper between them. And they milled them so that each one is at a very slight angle. So as you're going up the walls are like aiming toward each other, but ever so slightly. It's amazing construction that he did. There's that pointing to that stairway we talked about. 50 feet wide, extended 56 feet above the street level. Underneath, there was a street full of vendors, and there still is evidence of that today. It was a major market area. We're almost done with the slide presentation, then we're going to do a quiz, see what you remember, okay? But right along here, there's 2 gates right here. Do you see those little black dots? And there's also some stairs there. You can't see it in this picture very well. This you can see it a little better. There's some stairs coming up here. This is called the Huldah Gates, named after the prophetess Huldah. Another view of them. And this is them today. They've been excavated and are still visible. It's very possible this is where the Psalms of Ascent, okay, the end of the Psalms, 120 to 134, often were quoted as people would march up those stairs and stand at the different levels and quote the different Psalms on their way into the temple. These are also called the teaching steps because it's believed that Jesus stood right here and did a lot of his preaching and teaching from these steps. All right, so that's just to kind of lay a groundwork. Next week, we're going to watch a video called Jerusalem. Amazing. Now, it's not Christian. It's put out by National Geographic, but they made it as an IMAX for IMAX theaters initially. They spared no expense in doing the photography. It is amazing. And what they've done is taken the three main religions, Muslim, the Jews, and then what they call Christians, which really is Orthodox Catholics, okay? To them, that's Christian. So they take those 3, and they take a young lady, like a teenager from each of those, and let her narrate what they believe and why the city is important to them and how these 3 people groups live right there in this same ancient city. So we're seeing a lot of the construction, the architecture of the city, the historical aspects of Jerusalem, a lot of amazing photography. So you don't want to miss that. It's like 45-minute video, and we'll start that pretty close to the very beginning of the Sunday school hour, and then that will kind of wrap up our series here. All right, get your Kahoot ready. One last quiz. This one is on some of the locations and that we had in our lesson today. And don't cheat, so put your maps away. All you need is your app. You ready? We have a number you're going to put in here, and the number is 923079, 923079. And here they come. All right, we have a little bit of a pause. I think you can still join, but go ahead and hit start. Are you ready? Your last chance to cheat. Here we go. Which Judean city is circled on this map? So there's a pin kind of poking in that Jerusalem, Jericho, Bethany, or Hebron. Directly north of the Dead Sea along the Jordan River. Let's see. Very good. Okay, Jericho is correct. Next. All right, now we're looking for the green pin. It'll be a circle around it, I think. Yep. So down there along the edge of the Dead Sea. Jericho, Sodom, Bethlehem, and Gedi. All right, take your guess. 3, 2, 1. Good. See, don't you like doing these better, don't you? Because you get right answers? Whereas the first one is like, wow, I got somebody wrong. All right. I like these better too. Make me feel good as a teacher that you're catching on. Here we go. Now the next one, another city, and there's a circle around a dot. Jericho, Jerusalem, Jezreel, Emmaus. The star in the middle. Star Bethlehem, maybe? I don't know. You are here, Emmaus. Oh, you got it. Good. Jerusalem. Good. Yep, the star represents Jerusalem, the capital. Just a couple more. Which city on this map? The faster you do it, the more points you get. Near the bottom, do you see it down there? Hebron, Kadesh Barnea, Bethlehem, and Gedi. To the left of the Dead Sea, along the bottom. Yes, the city of Hebron. A lot of Old Testament history took place there with Abraham and his family. Go ahead. Another city in the Judean hills, just below Jerusalem, we have Hebron, Jericho, Bethel, Bethlehem. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good. Bethlehem, yes. In the hills right below Jerusalem. 2 more, I think, and we're done with this quiz. Which town on the slopes of the Mount of Olives is marked with the yellow pin? Gethsemane, Bethany, Bethsaida, Bethel. Yellow, maybe we want to do a color matching. Okay, so yellow pin, yellow, Bethsaida. Gethsemane, Bethany, Bethel. Okay, good. It is Bethany. And the last one, bonus from the first map. Oh, which city is circled? Joppa, Netanya, Caesarea, or Ashkelon. Which city is circled? This is the one we've been reviewing every week. And it actually is Caesarea. Okay, Joppa was below Netanya and Caesarea above. Is that Jeremiah? All right, good job, Jeremiah. All right, we've got 2 minutes before 10, but we'll let you be dismissed a little bit early, and appreciate you coming and participating. And we'll see you next week for the lesson on Jerusalem.